Good morning and welcome to Mass Memorial Virtual Sunday School. Theme for the quarter, Stewardship and Mission, Our Obligation as Christians. Unit 3, Fulfilling Our Obligations to God and Society, Sunday, May 24th, 2026. Lesson titled, A Well-Earned Rest, Mark 2:18 through 28, King James Version. Our key verse, He said unto them, The Sabbath was made for men, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. Mark 2:27-28. The aim for our lesson today is to identify common themes in Jesus' challenges to the traditional practice such as fasting and Sabbath keeping, to value fasting and feasting as well as work and rest. To model a balanced life between fasting and feasting, working and resting, and advocate for others to do the same. Our lesson background, we only have one book this time, Book of Mark, and I'm just going to pick out a few terms to talk about other than the Book of Mark. The Book of Mark is the second gospel in the New Testament. The actual author is unknown, but scholars contribute its writing to John Mark, an associate of Apostle Peter. The second chapter of Mark deals with three aspects of Jesus' ministry: healing and sinners in need of grace, two Pharisees challenging Jesus on central religious practices at the time, which was fasting, and Jesus' challenge to the Pharisees on their rigid view of the Sabbath. Just a definition to remind us who the Pharisees are. They were one of the elite groups of religious leaders known for their strict enforcement of Jewish law, and a group that always wanted to challenge Jesus about certain issues, so they might find a way to turn him over to the Roman government to be killed. The Sabbath, we talked about that several times before in our lesson. Considered the seventh day of the week, and in some of our earlier lessons, we talked about the Sabbath being a day set aside from the beginning of creation, a day that God himself rested after creating heavens and earth. And in today's lesson, we see more reinforcement that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. And we'll talk about that in our scriptures. God designed the Sabbath not to burden people with rules, but to bless them with rest, renewal, and a time with God. And this burden with rules referred to what the Pharisees were doing. There's another term mentioned in our lesson called wineskin. Wineskin was a leather container or bottle for which wine was stored. And Jesus used the storing of this new wine in an old wineskin and the effect it would have on the wine. Jesus' teaching was in need of new wineskin, which means that his teaching required an openness, a flexible heart, and a willingness to let go of outdated practices. So we'll also cover that in our scriptures. Our first three verses of our scripture talk about the differences in the disciples. From Mark 2:18 through 20, I'll read each verse. Mark 2:18. And the disciples of John, and of the Pharisees used to fast. And they come and said unto him, Why do the disciples of John and of the Pharisees fast, but the disciples do not? Mark 2:19. And Jesus said unto them, Can the children of the bride chamber fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. And we'll talk about these scriptures because they are really poetic scriptures. Mark 2:20. But the days will come when the bridegroom shall be taken away from them, and then they shall fast in those days. The bridegroom here is considered to be Jesus. And in these three scriptures, it shows that religion from a distance can appear the same, which is where the Pharisees were standing. The Pharisees were concerned that John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, but Jesus' disciples were not. So Jesus had an explanation of this to the Pharisees. They were always trying to put him in a bind in terms of his answers. So Jesus explained that he was the bridegroom and was with them, and it was a time to celebrate, not moaning or moving in an improper way. He also said he said life with him was like a wedding feast. He emphasized that after his death would be a time for fasting, but joy should be with him in his response while he was in their presence. And this is a message to us that spiritual practices must match the moment. And that's what Jesus was trying to get the Pharisees to see. There was no reason to mourn, feast, or fast at the time. Faith that becomes a rigid ritual misses the celebration of God's presence. And so here we must ask ourselves, do we have rituals that are so rigid with tradition that we actually lose the meaning of why we celebrate them? And this can be in terms of Easter, the resurrection, his birth. Sometimes we get real rigid in what happened or why it happened, or we shouldn't do things. But Jesus is saying, no, you celebrate him with a joy and with a presence. And it's not meant to make people stiff or tight or to bind them or to burden them. So here again, he had to explain that to the Pharisees. They were always challenging Jesus. Now next, this lesson has three aspects of Jesus' response to the Pharisees and what they should be doing. And in our next set, we only have two scriptures. It says, new wineskins are needed, Mark 2:21 through 22. Mark 2:21, no man also seweth a piece of new cloth on an old garment, else the new piece that filled it up taketh away from the old, and the rent is made worse. That means the fabric is made worse. Mark 2:22, no man putteth new wine in old wine bottles, else the new wine does burst the bottles, and the wine is spilled, and the bottles will be marred, but new wine must be put into new wineskins. This has reference to the idea of Jesus' new kingdom. And so he compared his new religion, which is to this of one of putting a old patch on a new piece of clothes and putting new wine in an old wine bottle. And we often know what happened. You can't mix old and new sometimes because it doesn't work together. So Jesus gives the result of doing this, that the new fabric could pull away from the old, and the wineskin, due to fermentation, would burst or expand. So what Jesus was saying is that he was announcing something fresh. This newfound religion through Jesus was new. It said God's kingdom was breaking into the new world through him. So the Pharisees really couldn't grasp this new reality and this new philosophy. And Jesus was saying that his teaching required new wineskin. And what he meant by that, it required a fresh openness, flexibility of the heart, and a willingness to let go of outdated practices. Same principle applies today. We have to be open sometime to new practices instead of old traditions that bog people down with certain things. Jesus said his new philosophy required something new. And so when we look at the church today, this remains a big challenge, because traditions can be helpful, but they can also become barriers if they present God's Spirit from working freely. And we need to ask if certain customs, even in our music, in our activities, still help people to encounter Christ as they should, or have they become brittle wineskin, which means they are of no use. True faith must be alive, dynamic, and able to grow with God's ongoing work in the world. We look at the church sometime today, and it brings about a sadness sometimes, because we have to ask ourselves, where is the church in all the issues that we're facing? Are they outspoken, Or they have they become complacent in how they look at things? And so this is something we can ask ourselves, not just in our church, but in our families, in our communities, in our neighborhoods. Sometimes we just say, well, I'm throwing my hands up, that doesn't concern me, but everything really concerns every individual. So this was what Jesus was saying. His new religion required something dynamic. You got to be open to change. And we know we don't often like change. But that's what Jesus was telling the Pharisees. You got to be open. You can't stick with these same old outdated, burdensome traditions. So moving on, another aspect of this lesson covered the Sabbath. Okay? So one was fasting. The other one was new ideas. And now we're dealing with the Sabbath. And we've dealt with this before in terms of when the Sabbath was created and why it was created. So I'll read these first 4 verses actually, through to 26. Mark 2:23. It came to pass that he went through the cornfields on the Sabbath, and his disciples began as they went to pluck the ears of corn. Mark 2:24. And the Pharisees said unto him, Behold, why do they on the Sabbath day do that which is unlawful? Here again we get the Pharisees sticking to the law. Mark 2:25. And he said unto them, Have ye never read what David did when he had a need and was hungered, he and they with him? Mark 26. How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar, the high priest, and did show bread, which means he ate the bread, which is not lawful to eat, but for the high priest, and gave also to them that was with him. Now here the Pharisees were challenging Jesus on why his disciples was going in the cornfield plucking food on the Sabbath, because their traditions state that nothing is to be done on the Sabbath, not anything. And so Jesus came back with a response and said, Have you forgotten what David did when he was hungry? On the Sabbath, he went to the house where the priest, or the temple, and he ate the bread that was prepared for the priest, because the priest didn't eat everything like everybody else. The priest had a special meal. So David went into the house where the priest was and ate the meal, which in other words, Jesus was saying, are you going to go hungry because it's the Sabbath? Are you not going to eat? Are you going to starve to death in our own terms? And this is when Jesus got very firm with the Pharisees, because they had a different kind of mode for celebrating the Sabbath. Jesus said, if we look at verses 27 and 28, Mark 27, and he said unto them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. Now here, Jesus emphasized that the Sabbath was made for man, and this means that it was made for a day of rest. And this is God's gift to mankind. And it was not listed in our lesson, all the details of the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was part of God's creation when he rested on the seventh day. And resting on the Sabbath reminded the Jews of what God did for creation. It also reminded the Jews of God freeing them from slavery, because they were supposed to just rest in him. And in today's world, our life and our tend to push people to exhaustion. When we look at being overworked, there's no period of rest. And so when there's no period of rest, we end up suffering spiritually, emotionally, and physically. And if you don't believe that you work straight for a while, the body itself will shut you down. It will make you rest. When you get exhausted or overdone. But this Sabbath, according to what Jesus reminds us, is considered holy. It restores body and soul and allows space to encounter God. And then last Sunday, our speaker kind of brought this out when she said, the 46th Psalm states that be still and know that I am God. And so the Sabbath is not about idleness and intentional renewal, but it's about serving God and worshiping Him and getting back into that one-on-one relationship with Him. And the Sabbath is good for rest, but oftentimes we do everything on the Sabbath but rest. And we know that according to how we do things today. If we look back in the old days, people literally went to worship on the Sundays. But I think it would be hard to do that in today's time. But still, we need to find time to steal away and renew our relationship with God. And in terms of practical application, this lesson brings us the same truth that Jesus was trying to get to the Pharisees. The first part stresses the importance of the Sabbath, that it was a day of rest and renewal. And we also, as I mentioned, our speaker brought this out on last Sunday when she said, be still, a time to recognize that God is still in control. And we know if God Himself rested on the seventh, and we are mere humans, and we need time to reflect and be thankful. The Pharisees were so strict in their adherence of the law that it often brought misery instead of joy and abundance to its worshipers. For the church today, letting go of outdated practices and tradition can become barriers to getting God's message out. And we know that because we put certain stipulations on certain things. You can't do this or you can't do that. And oftentimes it just gets in the way of bringing people to Christ. And our congregation must ask if certain customs, again, those customs could be music or routines, do they still help people encounter Christ? True faith must be alive, dynamic, and be able to grow with God's ongoing work in the world. And there's a lot of work that need to be done, but oftentimes we have to wonder if the church is taking a back seat and not speaking out as God would have us. We need to do something other than eat, meet, and greet, like those many people have done in the past. And we need to ask ourselves, have we as a congregation or church become complacent and taken a hands-off approach to speaking the truth to power, feeding the sick, or even delivering communion to the sick and shut in? We can do something. If it's just a phone call to check on a member that has not been present in service for a while. And as we go through this summer and the months ahead, let us find a way to serve and worship God in our daily routines and as we move about in our community. Let's think about, are we letting traditions and we don't do this way or we don't do whatever that way? Are we letting these things keeping us from serving our God and the community? So I hope you've gotten something from this lesson, and I ask you to please continue to join us in our virtual presentation each Sunday morning. Thank you.